Thanks, Kamal and Damien, for your talks. And I wanted to look, toward, how, civil society and communities can, keep the pressure on Morocco. I was wondering your thoughts on whether there are opportunities, with all eyes being on Morocco later in this year at the United Nations Climate Conference. It's being hosted in Morocco late November, early December. So there'll be extraordinary, many thousands of representatives from countries across the world, trade unionists, activists, many of whom would have some knowledge and certainly want to express solidarity with the Sahrawi people. So, interested in your ideas as to what civil society, trade unionists could be doing in the lead up to and at the UN Climate Conference in Morocco.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a good one, and it's a great opportunity to highlight this issue. I think the way in which it could be most constructively used, the situation could be most constructively used, would be to highlight the human rights situation of the Sahrawi people. The repression of activists in occupied Western Sahara and the desolation of the Sahrawi people who've been excluded from living in their own land. And I think that if people raise that as an issue, as a human rights issue, it would embarrass the Moroccan government. I think that would be very useful. It would certainly be something that I think journalists would be looking for, because I used to be a journalist and I know that you're always looking for a bit of excitement at these events, and that could possibly create it, especially given that the Moroccan government would be very likely to react very negatively. My guess is if activists or unionists or others were to raise the issue of human rights of Sahrawi people, they would probably be thrown out of the country. If they were thrown out of the country, that's a news story, and that starts to raise the profile of the issue. I don't know that it's going to change anything, but it's certainly a good way of getting the issue back before the public.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, I think the role of the civil society in issues like this is very important. If you look at the history of similar issues like East Timor or South Africa or other issues in Africa, they achieved their aspirations or freedom only through the actions of people elsewhere, particularly in Europe, in America, and Australia. Good people who supported these issues, who kept raising awareness about them and kept them on the radar. Without international solidarity, it would have been very hard to achieve the independence of East Timor or the end of apartheid in South Africa. So yes, definitely this is an opportunity. In addition to raising the issue of human rights in Western Sahara, I think also the impact on the environment in Western Sahara could also be raised, particularly through the exploitation, terrible exploitation, plunder of resources of Western Sahara, water, agriculture, salt, sand, the fisheries, the phosphate, and the occupation itself and the building of that huge wall in Western Sahara damaged the environment and continue to damage it in Western Sahara and affected the lives of the indigenous population in the territory. So the occupation has been a terrible factor in damaging the environment in Western Sahara and continues to do so. And of course this has to be raised, and not many people have tackled this area.
Thanks so much. My name is Randy, and I just wanted to ask a quick question about the lack of human rights mandate in the UN Security Council mandate in Western Sahara. So one of the issues is that it's the only active mission that doesn't have a human rights mandate. And as we talk about some of the possibilities, one of them might be that Sahrawis who are living in the occupied territory don't have the same rights. What that means for language, what that means for clothing, what that means for culture and expression. And in terms of pushing back, do you see any possibilities around adding a human rights mandate in terms of what we can do, writing letters? What do you see in terms of the possibilities? I know France is a massive barrier in that, but do you see that as possibly changing?
Thank you. That's a very good and important question. I think that if we can persuade our politicians to put human rights on the agenda internationally, then that's a great achievement. I'm not entirely convinced that this current government would be inclined to do so. I understand that the Foreign Minister has essentially said it's a terrible situation, but it's not something we can do anything about, and it doesn't involve us. In the meantime, Australia is one of the key importers of phosphate from Western Sahara, and that is the main commodity that's exported, which in fact justifies the Moroccan occupation in economic terms. If there's a change of government after July 2, we have a very much greater chance, I believe. I would like to think that Australia would be one of those countries that would raise this issue publicly, internationally. But the reality is, activists, civil society groups around the world need to pressure their governments in Spain, in France, in the United States, here in the UK, and so on. And you need to target those politicians who are prepared to speak up, those who have a moral conscience, and those who believe that their voice, even though it might be a lone voice, is one which can stand out and sometimes be heard. How it's done is always going to be a combination of factors, but people writing to, talking to, persuading political leaders, people acting through civil society organisations is always useful and constructive. And I think that if we're going to have international attention focused on Morocco, then perhaps there ought to be a campaign arranged around it internationally, which concentrates that effort on bringing the human rights violations, the human rights situation in the occupied area, as well as those people who are displaced, to the fore at that time. If we can bring it to a juncture, the whole issue about what I was trying to get at before is you really only can achieve significant political change of this type at moments of critical juncture, political critical juncture. A crisis of legitimacy is one such juncture. If you can create a crisis of legitimacy in a government, then there are numerous opportunities. It's about questioning the legitimacy of an occupying power, of asking the questions, why do you have a war? Why do you maintain a standing army of 140,000 in this occupied area, which under international law is not yours? And so on. If we can persuade political leaders to ask these questions publicly at a time when international attention is focused, then perhaps we can start to get that momentum moving.
Yeah, thank you. I think the worst human rights abuse that the Sahrawis face is the lack of self-determination and the fact that they haven't been allowed to decide their own future through a referendum. But it is really, MINURSO, the UN mission in Western Sahara, is the exception to the rule. There is no UN mission that has been established since the 1970s without a human rights mandate, except MINURSO. And it's a scandal. It's really, it's a terrible thing. And every time this issue is discussed at the UN Security Council, almost all members agree except one, which is France. So it's denying MINURSO to have a mandate of human rights monitoring in the territory. We all know through reports of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Freedom House, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, the U.S. State Department report on human rights of April this year states clearly that Morocco is abusing human rights, and I quote, "It's engaged in physical abuse, beatings, and other mistreatment of detainees, of political detainees." Amnesty International says the same thing. So everyone knows there is human rights abuses, and the UN should be monitoring and reporting on these, but it's not allowed to do so. I think we need to continue to push this issue and lobby for the UN to adopt it. Of course, Morocco sometimes says there are human rights abuses in the refugee camps by the Polisario, but why not allow the UN to monitor these refugee camps? Why not allow the UN to report on it, which is a third party, a neutral party, and it should be doing so. They refuse because they know they are hiding something. They cannot allow the UN to monitor human rights in Western Sahara. But of course we need to continue to make this issue as an important one, but we should not be diverted from the main issue. The end of the troubles for the Sahrawis, the end of any abuse to the Sahrawis is when they are able to decide their future and go back home. That is the main issue.
Thank you for your speech. I'm really interested in the fight for national self-determination for Western Sahara. Is there a relationship or link between the people within Western Sahara and the Polisario in their fight and progressive movements within Morocco? I'm thinking of the Democratic Path, the main left-wing party in Morocco. Are there any links that might help break the deadlock? And I'm also, another question, the Green March in 1975, where Morocco organised the movement of 300,000 unarmed civilians to stake a claim in Western Sahara. Are those people still living in Western Sahara? And how does that affect the possibility of maybe a referendum for national self-determination in terms of who has the vote, etc.? And in 2010, Polisario activists set up a protest camp a few miles outside of the Western Saharan capital, I think Laayoune, and which was brutally suppressed by, it was a peaceful camp, it was brutally suppressed by the Moroccans, and according to Noam Chomsky, it was an inspiration for the Arab Spring, which is interesting. But I was wondering, I'm thinking about the US involvement. There's a group called the International Crisis Group. I'm assuming they're funded by the United States, and they're arguing that the UN, its policy of national self-determination is too sectarian, too strict, and they want to dilute and water down the principle of national self-determination to include a more a weaker approach, like a self-determination to include cultural autonomy, civil liberties, democracy, equal access to resources within the state, as opposed to a one-size-fits-all national self-determination approach, which they say is too sectarian and won't achieve any results. So what is the, even though the United States pays lip service to the principle of national self-determination, decolonisation, what's their role in sort of maintaining the status quo in the area? Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Those are really good questions. The answer to the first one about the democratic path, or Nahj al-Demokrati, it says in Morocco, yes, they have been very supportive to the independence of Western Sahara and to the cause, but they paid heavily for this because their leaders were imprisoned for 18 years and disappeared and tortured in Morocco. So, but they continue to support the cause for Western Sahara, and they are a unique exception in Morocco. Not, you know, I'm not aware of any other parties that they do so, but there are people, you know. You have to bear in mind that in Morocco, in the constitution, there are three things you are not allowed to tackle. The divine authority of the king, the religion, and what they call territorial integrity of Morocco, which means you cannot question the Western Sahara issue, and if you do, you end up in jail or being killed. Despite all of this, there were lots of brave Moroccans who defied and expressed solidarity and support for the Sahara, because among them members of the democratic path. And in more recent times, there have been intellectuals and media, even some journalists visited the refugee camps and wrote articles saying that these people are not detained, because the propaganda in Morocco is that Sahrawi refugees are being detained by the Algerian army in the camps. And there are also people from other countries, not Sahrawis, in the refugee camps. So very few people are able to be aware in Morocco of what is the reality of what is happening. And a lot of them are even ignorant about, where is Western Sahara. There is a high rate of illiteracy and poverty in Morocco, and so they don't know much about what's going on. With regard to the settlers, some of them returned, but some continue to live in Western Sahara. They usually don't intend to live indefinitely. I think very few of them have bought houses and moved their families. They come to work and benefit from the resources of the territory, and also the fact that Moroccan government subsidize the everything in Western Sahara. But their participation in the referendum is not a question anymore, because we have agreed to Baker Plan 2, which stated that Moroccan settlers who lived in the territories since 1999 can participate in an eventual referendum which would take place 5 years after a transitional period of autonomy under Moroccan sovereignty. But despite this, Morocco refused. Some say, and I think it's true, that Morocco cannot even trust the settlers to live in a democratic country, a republic, where they can benefit from jobs and freedoms.
They cannot trust their own people.
Yeah, they cannot trust their own people.
There's a possible alliance.
Yeah. So that is about the settlers. The other, Gdei Mizik. Gdei Mizik was a major event. I think about 20,000 people moved from Al Ayoun, the capital of Western Sahara, and set up a camp in the desert and stayed there, demanding for the rights, particularly the right to self-determination and freedoms, basic freedoms. And they were attacked by the Moroccan army one morning, and the camp destroyed. Many people got injured. And yes, this happened before the events in Tunisia. So I think Noam Chomsky mentioned that it could be
inspiration.
The beginning of the Arab Spring. And Gdei Mizik continues because most of the Sahrawis, I think around over 20, have been sentenced by military courts to life imprisonment, 25 years in prison, 17 years in prison. These are young, peaceful activists who have done nothing except demanding for their rights. And the people are still, continue to demonstrate in Western Sahara, demand their rights peacefully. And they get, tortured and attacked by the Moroccans. With regard to the last question, I think Damien would talk about that. It's the ICJ, and the issue of the right to self-determination, which I think started in America. Right?
There's two issues that need to be raised here. The United Nations actually has a very clear model for determining who should vote in referendums on self-determination. And it was that model that was used in East Timor. So Indonesian settlers, even though they had been in East Timor often for very many years and had raised families there, were not given the right of the vote. Timorese who were expatriates who lived in Australia, Portugal and elsewhere were given the right to vote. Having said that, if Polisario Front agreed to the Baker Plan to allow Moroccan settlers of a certain standing to also vote, that is a choice they can make. So, in part, if there was to be such a vote, it would be negotiated between the United Nations and the Polisario Front as to who would have a legitimate vote in a self-determination situation. In terms of the watering down, the International Crisis Group was founded by our very own Gareth Evans and has frankly done a lot of good work under him and subsequently. It's been a very useful organisation. But in terms of, I think what you're referring to is, I've lost count now, but there's something like 140 independence movements around the world, often very small, many of which are quite insignificant, but some of which are large and have military forces and engage in activity. The difficulty is that, with one or two exceptions, none have been successful. I worked in East Timor and I still work there quite often. That was successful primarily because under international law, East Timor, Portuguese Timor, was never regarded legally as a part of Indonesia. That was a fundamental criteria which differentiated it from West Papua and from Aceh. And I've worked in both of those places too. I was advisor to the peace process which ended the Aceh conflict. When the Free Aceh movement gave up its claim that its invasion by the Netherlands in 1873 was illegal under international law, and recognised that in 1948 that it had at that time accepted to be part of Indonesia. So under international law, Aceh was part of Indonesia. So when the peace talks took place in 2005, following the Boxing Day tsunami, the Free Aceh movement had to come to a position where they would say to themselves, under international law, we do not have a claim to separate status. We cannot support that. So we will opt for an alternative. And what they opted for was what was ultimately called Pemerintah Sendiri, which is self-government. And everybody said, what the hell does self-government mean? And we said, well, that's what we're negotiating. And we then wrote, I think, about 110 or 115 points which detailed what self-government meant. And it essentially meant that Aceh became independent in everything but for foreign policy, external communications and defence. So it actually, and I think 30% of its revenues went to the central government. So that was one of those compromise type situations, but it's within the context of Aceh not being recognised in international law as separate from Indonesia. When we come to Western Sahara, international law says that it is separate. Western Sahara is not part of Morocco under international law. So the autonomy model, which I think you're referring to, may apply if Polisario agreed to it, but it doesn't have any standing in international law. So if there is to be a referendum, it would have to at least have a provision in it for autonomy or independence, as East Timor had. And that was East Timor's choice. They were being offered independence or autonomy, and autonomy meant remaining as part of Indonesia, but having control of their internal affairs, which they didn't believe or trust, and they voted for independence. Aceh didn't have that option, because under international law it was in a different situation.
Western Sahara is a lot better off in terms of...
Western Sahara is in the same position under international law as East Timor. So in theory, should it be offered the option of a referendum. The referendum must include the option of independence.
And maybe they could link up with progressive forces in Morocco.
Well, that goes back to the crisis of legitimacy of a government, which creates the space in which these things can happen. I should mention, I came back last week from a meeting with the Kachin Independence Organisation in Myanmar. A crisis of legitimacy of the previous regime ultimately led to elections last November in Myanmar. Those elections were not entirely democratic, but they did produce a civilian-led government. And that fundamental change of the political environment in Myanmar, Burma, and I call it Myanmar because now the National League for Democracy also calls it Myanmar. That fundamental change, which came as a consequence of a crisis of legitimacy, has now opened up a space for negotiation with the armed ethnic groups, which had a meeting Monday before last and are now establishing a framework for a resolution, they believe, a resolution to their outstanding claims. Now, it's a long way between where we are now and achieving a successful outcome to that process, but the process has started because there was a crisis of legitimacy in the government. So if that can happen in Morocco, that might also create a similar opportunity.
I just had a couple of points. Really following on from the last question, at the moment, I think Damien mentions 140 independence movements. I don't know where you got that figure, it sounds pretty right. But the one important process of the last couple of decades has been a large number of, quotes, peace processes around the world. Like Northern Ireland, I don't want to make too much of an analogy here, but there's former guerrilla wars or civil wars which went on in Northern Ireland, even in Colombia, in El Salvador, in a whole lot of parts of the world. The question would, I think, arise when we're looking at analogies, if it has any help at all. You know, where does the question of Western Sahara fit into this process? Because it does seem to be a trend at the moment that former guerrilla war struggles that have been taking place are now moving into at least some kind of peace process. Even the most intractable one, like Colombia, which must be almost the worst one in the world. How specifically can this happen? Is it possible that the domestic situation in Morocco can develop to the point where a peace process could develop there and that some kind of autonomy movement happen? The second point is there is a specific link to Australia which would seem to be important as a possibility for a campaign here, and that is there's an Australian company that imports a lot of, actually I think it's the largest amount of superphosphate from Morocco. If we were to look at the question of a boycott campaign or trying to develop a boycott campaign about Moroccan superphosphate coming to Australia, maybe that's where we could really put some pressure on. The economic boycott campaign is very, very important, as we've seen in regards to Israel and Palestine, among other extended analogies. But I just wonder, if the speakers could comment on those 2 points. Thank you.
Thanks for that. We had a meeting, or I had a meeting with some also people with Incitec Pivot, the phosphate importing company, year and a half ago, I guess, and they actually said then that they were looking to reduce and eventually stop their imports of phosphate from Western Sahara. Now, whether or not they do is another matter. It's easier to say things, and it's not clear that they will necessarily follow through, but they understand that this is an embarrassment, that the union that works in their company is not happy with their processes. The union also recognises, though, that if they don't find an alternative source of phosphate, that the business will close down and they'll lose their jobs. Yeah. So there's certainly there can be pressure. I mean, of course, there's always going to be a market for phosphate in a country like Australia because Australian farmers believe it's necessary for agriculture. In terms of the movement towards peace processes, I've had the fortune, I guess, of being either involved in or on the edges of a number of them. Colombia, I met one of the negotiators from Colombia about a year ago in Europe, and that, like many others, was a consequence of what they call a hurting stalemate. And a hurting stalemate is where both sides are suffering so badly that they find all they need is an excuse to come to the table to work it out. And then they need a process or a mechanism by which they can achieve at least their minimum aims, if not their maximum aims. And that's what they've done in Colombia. That's also what they've done in Mindanao with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. That peace process looks like it's coming to an end now. The agreement is essentially completed, it just needs ratification by Congress. That creates an autonomous Moro homeland in Mindanao with, again, self-government, and they used Aceh as a model for that. I think it will be slightly more extensive, but it's a similar sort of process. About a year and a half ago, I was in El Salvador. Interestingly, I was in El Salvador in 1981, at the peak of the Civil War. And the people I went to visit this time, who were guerrillas whom I met then, are now in government, which was a little bit gratifying. But El Salvador is not a country of peace, I've got to say. And it is a country which is still deeply ideologically divided and in which there is still a winner-take-all mentality. So whilst they have ended the war, they have not achieved the peace. I think it's important to say. El Salvador has the highest murder rate in the world, which it exchanges every other year with Honduras. But per capita, it's an enormously dangerous place to be still. So whilst the war no longer continues and the FMLN has achieved government, or the presidency, it's still got a long way to go. So that's not yet as successful as it could be. But there is momentum towards peace. There is momentum towards trying to find resolution. I had the opportunity of talking with the Tamil Tigers in 2007, and we talked about a negotiated outcome to their claims for independence. And they wanted an absolute independence, and they had a very clearly demarcated territory. In the end, they realised that they couldn't militarily achieve it. So they agreed to a proposition where they would have a federal system where there would be two states under a federal administering body. One would be a Sinhalese state, the other would be a Tamil state. And I said, great, you've achieved it, you're there. And they said, well, except we want to get Trincomalee first, because that's going to be our new capital. And Trincomalee was then in Sinhalese government hands. And because they hesitated, there was a change of government. The new government was much more militaristic, and they relaunched the war. I was there when it happened. I mean, I actually spent my last night on the floor as the bullets were going backwards and forwards. So that was one of the failures, if you like. One of the failures which ended up with some 40,000 people being killed as a consequence. But it was within reach, and that's the important thing. Had they not said, and we want Trincomalee, those 40,000 people might not have died, and we might have had a resolution to that conflict. So, yes, there is a push broadly towards peace. War does not suit the great powers, and it generally doesn't suit the people who are involved, because it's a pretty awful process.
I think one might ask, what is the relation between Western Sahara, which is far away in Africa, and Australia? Well, first of all, what we are dealing with here is an issue of international law, of the right to self-determination, respect of human rights, respect of UN Charter and resolutions. And what Morocco did is unprecedented, unique. It's the first time since the establishment of the United Nations in 1945 that a country goes and annexes the territory by force. So that is very serious. If this is allowed to happen, there will be chaos. There will be precedents for others to do the same thing. But also because Australia has a connection in terms of the resources of the phosphates, which come from Western Sahara and being used in farming here by the people here. So everyone here would have, had a piece of Western Sahara in their breakfast or lunch, so it's relevant. Also, Australia sent a contingent of military to Western Sahara in the peacekeeping force there, and an Australian doctor died in Western Sahara. So it's very relevant, and people should be aware about it. In terms of where we are now, I would say that it's not bleak. We are in a better position. We are strong, and Morocco is isolated and is weak. In 1975, when Morocco and Mauritania invaded, we were few, and we had a weak army, and we had no arms and no equipment, and very few people have gone to university. Today, the Sahrawi Republic is a member of the African Union. 84 countries support us.
Morocco is not.
And Morocco is not. And 84 countries recognize the Sahrawi Republic as a sovereign state. We have part of Western Sahara under our control, where our army is based. And it's a huge army, as Damien mentioned. It's very well equipped. And more than anything else, the people are determined, both in the camps, in the liberated territories, and in Western Sahara. And this is a decolonization issue. No one can change this fact that Western Sahara is on the UN list as a non-self-governing territory. Its people are entitled to the right to self-determination. No one can change this fact, except the Sahrawis, who would decide. And they are determined to continue. They're not going anywhere, and we are stronger than ever before. Morocco today is not important. It used to be in the Cold War, not anymore. It doesn't have many resources. Its economy is not that strong. This system in Morocco is not very strong. It's based on an absolute monarchy, while you can see changes happening all around it. And this is a family that ruled Morocco since 1666 by force. So we will see the cracks in the system, and we have seen them already. There is a movement called the February Movement in Morocco, which is demanding change. And with the internet, with social media today, with what is happening elsewhere in the world, Morocco cannot be isolated from it. So I would say the situation is not that bleak. We are determined, we are stronger, we will continue, and we will achieve our independence. If you look at East Timor in 1995 or 96 or 97, no one would have predicted what happened. The same thing in South Africa, in Eritrea, in Namibia. If a people want to be free, there is no way you can stop them from having it. And it's our right. It's our legitimate right, supported by international law, by the UN, and we are there, and we exist, and you cannot just change that fact. Sorry.